Persian poetry ultimately addresses issues that are plaguing the Western mind. How do we live life? What is the purpose of being here? What is a moral code, an ethical code that I can live by? These issues, these liberalism and secularism has produced some positive results in terms of physical conditions, but has failed to answer these deeper questions. What's life all about? That's why you have this paradoxical situation where the most physically, materially well-off countries in the world also have some of the most depressed populations.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to the Real Talk podcast with your host, Terron and Roxanna. In this episode, titled Insights into Persian Poetics, we're delving into the deeply profound world of Persian poetry. Joining us to illuminate this topic is Brother Muhammad Ali Mojaradi, known online as Sharghzadeh, founder of Persian Poetics and the creative mind behind the viral hashtag Rumi was Muslim, which captivated the internet just a few years ago. I hope I pronounced your online pseudonym right. Yeah, it took a bit of
You
practice.
did, yeah. Most people say Sharghzadeh because, and I put the transliteration is always difficult in English, but it's probably more likely to be if you see a Persian name with Zade or A at the end, which means born of the East. But it actually means it's the Zadeh, which is just one aleph turned into a fatah, struck by the East. And maybe we could get into that later.
Yeah. I thought it's a very slick name and how it
Thank
translated
you.
to English, struck by the East or man from the East. It's really cool. But,
Thank you.
just to start with the traditional Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum, brother, and thank you for joining us on our platform to discuss what I believe is a very interesting topic. I mean, I find the Persian aspect of the Islamic heritage extremely fascinating. Moreover, it's remarkable how Persianist society not only extended across a vast geographical area from the Balkans in Eastern Europe to Bengal in the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, but also how it intricately wove itself into the fabric of these regions it inhabited, with poetry serving as a particularly significant thread. So just jumping right into it, what is your personal connection to this kind of literature? And while the most obvious link is your Iranian heritage, was there anything specific that drew you to Persian poetry? Like what initially sparked your interest in studying it more deeply?
Sure. Bismillah. First of all, alaikum assalam, and thank you so much for having me. I'd actually been watching your interviews a long time before we talked on Twitter, and I really appreciated that you guys brought on non-mainstream voices, or you weren't hesitant to poke and prod things that a lot of times, especially people who are born and raised in a particular understanding of Islam, they're very sensitive to cross certain lines or poke and prod. Essentially, every Islamic school of thought has this orthodoxy that it's kind of cut and sewn and ironed. And if you try to wrinkle it at all, people will get upset. So just accept it as it is and don't bother asking how things got there. And this is especially unpalatable to, I think, a vibe that we share is revert/convert people. So whether you enter Islam or whether you rediscover your Islamic heritage, like many Iranians in diaspora have, that's so unsatisfying. If you're raised in understanding, that's one thing. Okay, my whole family is Hanafi, Brelvi, whatever. I'll accept that. But if I'm just coming in and I have this whole Islamic paradigm, I could just land on any part of it. That's not satisfying to me to say, oh, don't ask any questions. But anyway, I have always had this sense that I should know. And this is a very Persian thing, this obsession with studying and learning and reading. Iranians, if you look, we have some of the highest educational attainments up to really ridiculous levels where, if you don't get a master's degree, you can't even get married in my community. You're like a failure, basically. So let alone a PhD is like kind of the new master's right now for us. So I always had this sense that I should learn, that I should know, and that not knowing is embarrassing. And I actually distinctly remember visiting Iran for the first time as a 13-year-old where I kind of have more awareness. And I really felt insecure because I couldn't read anything. So anyone who's been to, I don't know, East Asia or maybe not to say India because there's so much English, but really places where there's no English signage except for some odd off things, you feel really out of place and weird. And then more so if people expect you to be able to read. And then you're like, oh man, I'm illiterate. I'm like, they think I'm a villager. So this was something that kind of struck me at age 13, 14. And eventually I moved to Iran and I started to learn Persian. But I was still embarrassed that I had this kind of low level understanding of the language, but I couldn't read poems that people had on the back of their car. Or when the news was going, I mean, to maybe make a parallel, it's not so much like in English, because in English, the news very much matches how we speak. But in Arab countries, the news is in a completely different register of classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic than the day-to-day speech. So I'd hear the news, I couldn't really understand it. I'd see people's handwriting, couldn't read it. And I felt, okay, I need to do more. I'm living in Iran, I'm going to school there. They even actually told me I couldn't join the literature class. They said, your Persian is not good enough. So, we'll create some sort of alternative for you. So I said, okay, now I have to take a step and just learn to read poetry. But what actually ended up happening was it wasn't just something I had to tick off. I actually ended up really liking it. I found that at the same time I was going through this, and I love also that you have skeptic as part of your name, this skeptical phase where I didn't even want to identify as Muslim. I thought, you know what, this religion you guys have passed down, none of it makes sense. We're living in the modern world. And a lot of poems actually initially by Omar Kayam answered a lot of, or I shouldn't say answer necessarily, but I felt like it resonated a lot that, wow, someone in my culture 1,000 years ago is asking these same questions, wondering about the same things that I'm wondering about. So I'd say that is what really hooked me in, that I thought, wow, it's not like it's not our version of Shakespeare. It's not some boring medieval work from people from a time that has nothing to do with me. It's actually talking about issues that have immediacy. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh no, it definitely does. And there's something that you said in that really stood out, is that when you wanted to read something that was in Farsi or in Persian, say a line of poetry on the back of a bus, you weren't able to. I'm just curious, in Iran itself, the country, is Persian, this kind of poetry that we're going to talk about today, is it very much intertwined with the daily life of the regular Iranian? I asked that question because, as you know, as everyone know, I'm from California. We have a large Iranian population. It was nothing for me to bump shoulders with an Iranian or someone, as I've come to find out later, was of Iranian nationality, but was from a minority group. I just didn't get the feel of this poetry. It just never came across. So to find out that it's very much a part of Iranian society today, can you get into that?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that it's oftentimes you wouldn't pick it up as a non-Iranian because of the language barrier. It's very hard to convey poetry. Uh, Usually Iranians living in America who have enough of a connection to Iran to appreciate the poetry, maybe be from Iran as opposed to of the heritage like me. Usually their Persian is not at or their English isn't at a level to express it. So oftentimes you won't get the impression that poetry is very important and relevant in the day-to-day lives of Iranians. But if you go to Iran, I would say that probably an Iranian couldn't live a day in their life without reading or hearing a couplet of poetry. That if you're in the street, it'll be on the back of a car or be on a storefront, on the guy's window, he'll have, like, I think the word is apothecary, like we say atari, selling traditional medicines. And he'll just have a big couplet, 4 poem couplet from Attar, the famous apothecary, also poet Sufi that I'll talk about later, about the job. Or, the taxi driver who's upset will complain about the economy by quoting a couplet about an unjust ruler. Or you'll scroll through social media, and a lot of times Iranians will see every fourth or fifth poem or post on their social media is just a poem. So this is how present it is in the culture, and I can't really think of an equivalent art form that really dominates everyone's imagination. So I think that's probably the best way I could sum it up. It's just something you're always coming across. You can't ignore it. And that's why all Iranians are poetry inclined, because it's not an activity for the elite. It's not like golf in America. It's, I don't know, it's more like basketball. Like, you'll just walk in the street if you live in a city and you just see people playing in a park. You could shoot a hoop or two, or you could, hope to join the NBA. But in either case, no person who grew up in America probably can say I can't shoot a basket, I would guess. So probably no one in Iran could say, yeah, I can't recite any poem. They'll probably recite something. Like me, maybe it'd take me 3 chances to get it in, but I could get it in, right? Because I grew up playing basketball. And, likewise in Iranian, they might have to think really hard to quote something by Hafez, but they'll do it at some point. So I think that's the best example I could give you all.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that Iranians, probably aside from many other people, have poetry so intertwined in their day-to-day life. When I read the article that you have on your website, Persian Poetics, I tried to think of a culture whose any kind of musical art form plays such a role in their day-to-day life. I mean, I tried with my own ethnic background as a Black American. Does rap music, which is kind of a form of poetry, does it play a role in our day-to-day life? And Not to the degree that I come to understood as it did with for Iranians, which is confirmed by a lot of other people who have been to Iran and have seen it for themselves. But not to move too sideways, can you
No
tell
worries.
us about the genesis and impact of your viral hashtag Rumi was a Muslim? How do you think it has influenced the public interest and understanding of Persian poetry?
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that, and I might take that from you with permission, use it going forward. That is actually an excellent, very close example of something like Persian poetry, because although every Black American might not like or care for rap, this is like a stereotype many non-Americans have. It's like a lot of Black folk actually like, yeah, I don't care about that stuff. But the average Black person appreciates that it's a part of the Black culture and identity in America. And globally, people understand this. The same way that global-minded people say, oh yeah, Persians, poetry, Hafiz, Sadi. The average non-American say, oh yeah, Black people, they make the rap music is kind of their thing. And
Yeah.
that not every Black American, but a lot of Black Americans can recite rap lyrics, or they love rap music, or they feel passionately, or they identify with the way Iranians identify with Hafez or Saidi or Rumi. And that itself can tell you about their persona. Black Americans will say, my favorite rapper is this person or that person. So if someone says, my favorite rapper is Lupe or Immortal Technique, you can sense their political leanings
Mm.
versus if they say, someone else. So anyway, to answer your question directly, basically, I had been writing about this issue, not necessarily writing, but posting on social media for quite some time. And eventually, I have a good friend, Zarar Ali, who is also a translator and kind of active on social media as well, but more of a creative. He does a lot of photography and videography, who is a campaign guy. So I was not into campaigns, not into politics at all, but he was always launching online campaigns. So he came and we kind of collaborated. And he said, well, why don't we make an online campaign about this issue? Because basically, he said it in the nicest way, this is how you're going to get it out there. Like, just tweeting about it isn't going to do it. You need to give people something to do with this information when they're upset. So we decided to come up with this hashtag together. Rumi was Muslim. And we started working on, how to convey it. And I just put a thread out there, and it just happened to go viral. And I think it was because it was Ramadan right before iftar time in North America. So the Muslims were really hangry. They wanted something to be angry about. They're sitting scrolling, killing time. So basically what happened is it went viral, and we pushed out this website that kind of explained everything in a more thought out way. And really, until this day, I'm really surprised by how it has changed people's perception of Persian poetry. Because before, no one really talked about this issue. I think there was just one article by, if I pronounce it right, Rosanna Ali on the Wall Street Journal, I think. And that was the only thing we could find when we were searching. But now when you come across people, they'll just commonly mention it to me. When they say, what is your job or what do you do? I say, oh, I teach and translate Rumi. They say, oh, yeah, isn't he really mistranslated? Or someone told me to be careful. And I said, oh, yeah, that is true. And they won't even know that it was instigated by a project I was involved in. They'll just say, oh, I've heard this. People say this now, or Muslims have told me. So I think that's really great. That I love that this is a thing that people now know. And they, even greater than Persian poetry, the idea that you should beware of what translation of a text you purchase. Even with something as important as the Quran, you see mosques, they'll just get the translation that's distributed for free, the Sahih International Version by Saudi Arabia. That in certain issues like وَأَذْرَبَهُنَّ and strike them, it will say and beat them, without any footnote explaining that there's a difference of opinion. Or on many issues like it won't give context to verses that say, disbelievers will go to hell here, or then other places that say they'll have a chance, etc. Just giving small examples. So we don't even think about the Quran, how it's being translated, unfortunately. You go to most mosques, it's just God knows what the translations are there. So hopefully we could just increase this awareness, because we will be a translation-oriented community. Muslims living in the West, it's just unrealistic to expect them to all acquire fluency in a second or third language. It's just not realistic. So if we're going to be reading in English, why don't we have some awareness of what we're reading?
And the point you brought up about the Quran is a really good one. I mean, as I've been Muslim for 10 years, and it wasn't until like several years ago did I really consider the translations that I was reading. And then you also brought up another good point of translating Islamic materials. I mean, let alone translating them faithfully, but just having an abundance of Islamic material in English is probably more necessary than ever, considering that English is the language of the internet. It's one that Muslims internationally communicate on a day-to-day basis. And it would just be helpful to have more literature in that language to kind of help more Muslims along. And faithful translations are definitely integral to that.
Yeah. So yeah, I hope that we can change that, man. It's sad. I mean, I have a couple over there. I wish they were by my hand. I'd show you just English books. So occasionally in Turkey and Kuwait, here where I am, you'll see these English stands in mosques for tourists, and the material is sometimes dreadful, man. Sometimes I read it and I'm embarrassed. I think, if you just got rid of this, and I don't even know, and just like gave them the message movie or something on a CD, it would be better than these ridiculous, poorly translated, no awareness of the cultural context pamphlets and things. Like, for example, I'll give you the adrabahunna example. Like, an intelligent way to address this, hopefully, would be to say something like, yes, some Muslims understand this as to be, others understand it as to quit. Maybe most Muslims do in the traditional Islamic world do accept this as to be, but it's not a barrier to enter Islam to accept the minority opinion. That's not a barrier for us. If you just want to say it's to quit, that doesn't mean you can't be Muslim. Say it's to quit. 1,000 years ago, scholars were saying this, but it's different when the translator is like, no, no, you see, this is a gentle beating, like a tap, like a hit, like this, like, hey. And I'm like, well, that doesn't appeal to his sensibility because he still views that as childish and domineering, this like white guy or white couple. Like, I'm just seeing this in Turkey. I'm like, no, my God, don't say that, dude. Anyway, so if we can go on, I don't want to belabor that point too much.
No, no, no. I totally know what you mean. I think we Roxanna and I have talked about it because we dealt with it in another podcast with one of our guests who had an interesting interpretation of that verse.
All right.
And yeah, it points out the quagmire of sort of translating theological text versus secular texts and the complications involved in both and how they're very different. In terms of the development and the roots of Persian poetry before and after the advent of Islam, what were the earliest forms of Persian poetry, and how was it defined? What characteristics define the genre pre-Islam?
Unfortunately, what we know about pre-Islamic literature, or just really anything about Iranian history, is complicated by the fact that, and there is I think a Greek or Latin word for it that I wish I had it on the top of my mind, which is the idea that you purposely destroy or dismantle the remnants of an earlier culture or earlier lineage. So you see this all the time in the Near East, where you see a mosque had been built using the bricks of a temple, or a church is built. Like Rome, for example, is just a quarry where they were just taking temples apart and building churches or basilicas. This was a mainstream, practice. If anything, the fact that the pyramids survived, for example, is just a miracle. Because in the pre-modern world, everywhere, there was no sense of, this is a very modern, like a post-Renaissance idea that you should preserve things from the past. People in the past didn't really care. So unfortunately, we think a lot of times we say Persian Empire pre-Islam as if there's just one distinct peoplehood, like the modern nation of Iran existed then. When in reality, there were several groups who all kind of had the same origins. Of course, we could broadly say they're Persian, but when you're dealing with vastly different groups like the Sasanians and the people who came before, but the Sasanians were the very last people before Islam. They particularly, we know so little about the Achaemenids, and I might be mixing some things up, but we know so little about the people who preceded them is because they had a kind of, I don't know if scorched earth isn't the best word, but they had a similar policy of just destroying what came before to erase the legacy. So, and before then, such a thing also existed. So very little writing actually survives. It's not like we have a whole dossier of books, with the exception of Zoroastrian texts. So we have those texts, but it's not like we have, popular novels and literature just laying around. We have inscriptions. So there's poems on inscriptions, for example, in Persepolis you can go. But generally, we can say that the impetus to care about poetry is a post-Islamic one. That Islamdom, and coming from the Arabs and their obsession with poetry, and Jahili poetry, we can talk about that. This idea that poetry is an important art and that effort should be expended into it is a post-Islamic one. This is a mistake we often make, to think that we have this relativist idea that all cultures care about all things equally. Well, that's not true. You can go to cultures where they barely have any poetry, and cultures where, other cultures, I don't know, they barely care about one art or another art form, but another art form is very important. Like Europe, for example, painting and music is very central to European culture. Poetry is not so central, and even less so is spiritual poetry, right? It's not like they have this vast Sufi tradition, but within the Christian context. So unfortunately, before there is not much information, but we could say that, and another issue is that Old Persian, pre-Islamic Persian, is about as differs with New Persian, or the Persian that we contemporarily speak for the last 1400 years, just about as much as Old English and Modern English. Maybe a little bit less, but it's kind of like if you give Beowulf to someone, I think you're both in the UK, the amount that they would discern from Beowulf is about the amount that someone like even me could discern from like an old Persian text, the Avesta or something. Maybe scant things, you kind of vaguely pick it out. It's kind of like Latin in Italian. Maybe an Italian person could pick some things out, but you can't really connect it. So it's kind of a lost world for us. So Iranian civilization does extend back 5,000 years, but our consciousness is so deeply shaped by experience with Islam. It's kind of like it's 1,400 years old in a way.
So in a way, sort of tracing an evolution of Persian poetry that incorporates the pre-Islamic period is sort of a fool's errand, in the sense that we just have any real basis for a development in terms of themes, styles, and forms, etc.
Possibly. It may be, I mean, our imagination as a people probably didn't suddenly shift. So maybe we could say the character of Persian poetry, and it is very distinctly different than Arabic poetry. I mean, Arabic poetry, we joke as Iranians, but it's true. There's a lot of talk of camels and women and deserts and, things like that, because that's the environment they lived in. And in Persian poetry, we talk about, mountains and rivers and flowers and spring. So that character is definitely there, but in terms of the stylistic elements, you can't draw this straight line, I would say.
In terms of the sort of most influential medieval Persian poets, can you discuss or sort of tell us what their seminal works are, and particularly what their unique contributions were to the development of Persian poetry? Because obviously we have a huge wealth of resources in the medieval period.
Yeah, definitely. I'll start by saying that every answer to this question will include the bias of what country you're from. So if you ask an Iranian, they'll say Ferdowsi is so important because of the Shahnameh. Pakistani will say Iqbal, and an Afghan or Tajik will say Rumi. But basically, if you can break up Persian poetry into the Sufis and the court poets. So the Sufis would just be writing for spiritual reasons, and the court poets are working, in the context of like a royal culture. The Sufi poets, the most important one who's early is Sanai of Ghazni. And I think today the city is called Ghazni, but we call him Sanai Ghaznavi in Persian. And he is the first person to employ poetry as a medium for extended Sufi works. So earlier Sufis,
and what date was he born? Can you just give us
It must be like around 980s or around, let me see, Sanai Ghaznavi. It's like in the early, 1080, around that era, like around the year 1000. So about 1 to 2 centuries after Islam, Persian emerges as a written language again in Arabic script, and we start to see poetry written in New Persian. But it takes about 100 more years for Sanai to start actually using this poetry for distinctly spiritual reasons. And the reason is because Sufis were generally not educated in kind of the court context. So oftentimes they would have short, simple poems, 4-letter poems, 4-line poems called rubai or quatrain. Like, for example, Abu Sa'id Abu al-Khair, all the poems attributed to him basically are of this sort. Whereas Sanai was a court poet, and he eventually gives up the court life and leaves Ghazni and goes to Marv in modern Turkmenistan, although it doesn't really exist anymore. Or it might be on the border of Iran. I think, I'm not exactly sure what country the historical town fell into. But he becomes a Sufi, and then he returns to Ghazni, doesn't return to the court, but then he starts writing, basically using the molds and themes and ideas of court poetry, but to write Sufi themes. So this is why people ask, why would you talk about wine? Well, this is because they were using a vocabulary in a context that was, designed for the court where they weren't so religious. So Sanai kicks this idea of Sufi poetry being a very serious endeavor off. Then about a century later, Attar and Neyshabur, this time in Iran proper by modern standards, writes the famous Mantaroter, the Conference of the Birds, which is very famous in English translation, and also Tazkirat al-Awliya, biography of the saints, which hasn't been translated in English in a way that can be popularly read. Unfortunately, all the translations are super academic and actually not even a full translation. And then eventually, about a century after that, Rumi comes, who writes the Masnavi. We could talk more about it in the Divan Shams. And these guys kind of come in quick succession, like one century, another century, and another. And we kind of view them as, the first, the second, and the third. such that people, I think it's fabricated, but they say something like Sanoi ruh bud va ator do chashme u man az pei ator u Sanoi amadam, or something like that, where Rumi says that Sanoi was the soul and Atar was his eyes, and I came after Sanoi and Atar. And in his Masnavi, he constantly quotes and elaborates on their work. So you could say those are probably the three most important Sufi poets. And among the court poets, Rudaki is the earliest with surviving work. He's part of the context in which Persian actually re-emerges as a written language. But without a doubt, actually the most famous and beloved ones are Saadi and Hafez, who come in the 12th and 13th centuries respectively. And they're both from Shiraz, and they're probably actually by leaps and bounds the most famous court poets. So Persian poetry, you could really restrict it to these five figures, and really only in like a 300 to 400 year span. And I mentioned Ferdowsi. I don't really consider him a poet as much as I consider him a historian. So there's important to distinguish between a text that's written as poetry versus a text that just happens to be in rhyme and meter. Like, for example, Aqidat al-Tahawiyya, Imam Tahawi's famous like basic Sunni Aqidah, is written in verse, but no one would say it's poetry, so to speak, you know? So the same is true for my understanding of the Shahnameh, not read in full, is that the primary aim is to record Iranian oral and actual history from pre-Islam, not to necessarily like be a poem, if that makes sense. It just happens that epics were in meter and rhyme. So I don't even know if he's a poet in the same way. But yeah, I guess you can't not include him.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned the Conference of the Birds, because that was actually like the first piece of, well, actually, before I get to that, I'm glad that you made the distinction of what different categories of Persian poetry we have. I wasn't sure if when I talk about, or when I mention Persian poetry, is it specifically Sufi, or are there other genres? And I'm glad that you went over that there are different distinctions. For myself, the Conference of the Birds by Attar was my first introduction to Persian poetry proper, which I'll get into that later, why I use proper. And it really just opened my eyes to a world of the Islamic heritage that I had no idea about. I mean, my introduction to Islam was more of a Salafi origin, and I think everybody knows how Sufi ideology is viewed within that context. And so it kept me away from this kind of literature for a long time. But when I had the chance to read it for myself, and the concepts that Attar described, the journey of a believer and some of the hangups that you might have within that journey, just really spoke to what I find in human existence for people who do try to traverse a more spiritual journey, or a journey as a believer. So yeah, I'm really glad that you got into that. But so you went over who were the most influential of the Persian poets, but in the context of medieval Islamic poetry, what key works and innovations did the era's leading poets introduce? And how did these contributions shape the evolution and character of Persian poetry? And there is, before you get into that, there's one more poet that I would like to know of, because he wasn't mentioned, and I thought he would have been in the quote unquote Mount Rushmore of Persian poetry, is Omar Kayam. Where does he fit into the scheme of things?
Sure. First of all, to address your first comment, I think part of the reason Mantel is popular is because it has such a good translation by Dick Davis, who's a non-Muslim, right? So it just goes to show that our texts, we don't really care enough to deal with them seriously, so that non-Muslims, not that I have anything against that he's a non-Muslim, I love his work, but I just think it's sad. And you know, the Persianate tradition is so vast and was such an integral part of our society. And like you said, it's almost like it's not there anymore. But anyway, Omar Khayyam, I would say, is not really a poet, because whether or not he wrote those poems is highly debated. And I would say that most poems attributed to him are not by him. And that Fitzgerald's translation, which made him famous, is just not really a translation. It's more like inspired poetry in the same kind of vein. So also another issue is that Khayyam was never really regarded as a poet. Like in these Tazkiras, you don't really see much mention of him. And I would say that it's kind of just this weird mountain of mistaken attribution, where you have maybe some original poems that were by him, and then others got mixed in, and then they were kind of semi-translated into English. And because we're so impressed by Westerners liking us, Iranians became interested in him. So now he's been at the very hundreds of years after the canon has kind of closed its doors. They reopened and stuck him in and closed the doors again. but it's not, he's not really a poet in that sense. Like he's not considered to be part of that, part of the early great poets. Mostly because the real Khayyam was just an astronomer, a mathematician, and he wrote poetry on the side, like any erudite person of his age would do. It's nothing particularly unique about that. The greater issue is if you have a huge collection, if you're presenting yourself as a poet, if your poetry is being recited in gatherings. He wasn't like that. So to answer your questions about what innovations they had, I'd say the first and most important is actually writing Persian, right? So in the northeast of Iran is where you see courts like the Samanid courts, where they from in modern Tajikistan, they actually get their state legitimacy by claiming to be descendants of them. They start to write poetry in Persian. So initially everything was in Arabic, whether because they were Arabs or they were following the court culture of the Abbasids or the Umayyads. Everything was in Arabic. And actually in Baghdad as well, you see some Arabs writing a few words and lines in Persian, because Baghdad might have been a majority Persian city at the time, despite the Arab rulership. So that's the first significant input, is just the fact that Persian emerges. And then at some point, they began to write Iranian history into the Persian canon. So Daghighi actually starts this project of versifying pre-Islamic Iranian history that a different poet had actually written down in prose. So we have a different poet who everyone forgot, wrote it in prose. Daghighi versifies 1,000 lines and then gets killed. And then Ferdowsi picks it up and quotes the 1,000 lines, or either directly, or I would have to consult a Shahnameh expert, either directly or indirectly in the current Shahnameh. So he begins to chronicle Iranian history very early on. And this really helps solidify Persian as a literary language. And then, of course, we have Sanoi. Like I said, he opens up the doors for Sufism. And then people like Saadi and Hafez really make Persian a global language of literary excellence, because their poetry is so well beloved. And Saadi writes texts like the Golistan, which I'm actually teaching now on my website, which are taught from, like you said, the Balkans to Bengal to elementary school students, such that almost anyone from that expanse, if their ancestors were schooled in a madrasa, their grandparents could probably still quote the Golistan, whether in translation or in the original. And Rumi probably took the Sufi poetry to its max extent. So if Saadi and Hafez brought court poetry to its peak, Rumi is the one with his Masnavi who makes it so that, Persian is considered, when you even hear it, you associate with Sufi Islam. And I would say Hafez, what he did that was so interesting to kind of cover, I think I covered all the ones I mentioned just now. What he did that was so fascinating was that he merged court poetry and Sufi poetry without it being court poetry or Sufi poetry. Kind of create this merged category to where when you read him, oftentimes you're thinking, okay, is he a spiritual guy? Is this just a court poet who uses spiritual vocabulary because it was available? He kind of creates his own version of poetry. So he's only kind of a court poet in the technical sense, but his poetry does not read like other court poets oftentimes. So each of them kind of brings a little bit to the table, each of these very important figures.
And concerning the themes and poetry, concerning the themes and motifs, specifically concerning Sufi Persian poetry, can you discuss how themes like love, nature, and mysticism are interwoven in medieval Persian poetry, and what these motifs reveal about the cultural and spiritual mindset of that era?
Yeah, this is fascinating that you bring these up, because these are probably the three most common things that will pop up in any Persian poet, regardless of whether they're court or Sufi or a folk poet. We like the love is the number one topic. And the number one thing we use to liken things, simile, metaphor, etc., is elements of nature. So many different flowers means so many different things. Like a tulip means this, a daffodil means that, a rose means this, a river means that, a sea means this. We just love to think about nature. And this is something that is very much associated with the earlier days of Persian poetry, especially. So a lot of the earlier poets in Khorasan, so much so that Iranians call it Sapki Khorasani, like Khorasani style, where you see just tons and tons of poetry talking about the natural environment. And Sufis actually consider this a form of worship, to just observe nature, because they say it says in the Quran that you can find God's signs in yourselves, in the book, and in the afaq and the expanses. So you take this to mean that just dwelling on nature is a form of worship. And mysticism is so important. And after the Sufis especially come into play, so not before the Sufis, but after, not so much Sanoi, but Attar and Maulana, they make mysticism kind of the vocab of Persian poetry, such that people will read a poet and think he's a Sufi just because he uses so much mystical vocabulary, but really that just becomes the vocabulary of the genre. So I don't
Is
know
that
if
the
I
case with the tar?
no, so Attar is a Sufi, but someone like Hafez, for example, is decidedly not a Sufi. He vehemently disagrees with and dislikes and criticizes Sufis, but people think he's a Sufi because he uses their vocabulary, because it's just the I don't know, the parlance of I don't know, of the day that is just a common currency in that context. So what I would say, what they reveal is that Persians are people who love the idea of love. And of course, this is again one of those cultural relativistic things that you'd say, oh, don't all humans fall in love, and aren't all humans valuing the idea of love? And I would say, actually, no, as modern Westerners, we can say it's not true, right? It's common today for people to say, oh, who cares about love? You know, we have a hookup culture now. Or they say love are just emotions. It's just serotonin being released. I knew several intelligent worldly people from my college days who insist that love isn't even real, right? But then otherwise, you have cultures like Middle Eastern culture where when you see someone, you say "ahub," oh love, habibi, my beloved, azizam, we're just constantly throwing out die for you, which our vocabulary is just constantly inundated. And Iranians are just obsessed with the idea of falling in love and heartbreak. And this is even many converts who are, especially white converts, are very kind of, especially from Europe, very stiff, don't show your emotions. They can't deal with how emotionally charged and romantic and crazy we Middle Easterners are. So the fact that love, ishq, is such an important topic in the Persian canon, just it's reflective of this fact, right? And I think nature as well, because nature is so rare for us. You know, for us, for example, just to give you an idea to visualize it, the word paradise comes from pardis, which also gives the word firdaus that we have in Islam. Firdaus in Persian originally meant a walled garden, because if you look at places in Iran in the desert, like for example, the Shazde Bagh in Kerman, if you look this up, is a perfect example of this. Actually, in Mohan, outside of Kerman, it's like you build a wall and you divert water from a nearby mountain, and you create this little oasis. And outside of it is the desert expanse that you'll die if you spend 3 days out there with nothing. But when you go in the garden, the walls kind of surround you with the trees. You feel like you're in a heaven, because when you step outside, you're in hell, right? This is why, from our perspective, heaven is a walled garden, because that's a place where, you know, it's idyllic. So of course we're laying in these gardens, and the court poets, again, they're in the court, they're in the palace, they're just surrounded by a beautifully manicured, taken care of garden. So of course they're gonna constantly think and talk about nature. And mysticism, I think it's because Islam comes to the Iranian people, and the Iranian people have a different tab. They have a different temperament than the other peoples of the world. Like, for example, Salafi Islam can never take root in Iranian culture. It doesn't matter if the people are Sunni or Shia or not, whatever they are. Like Sunni Persians, it'd be very hard to sell them Salafism. Why is Salafism so pervasive in the Gulf? Because Gulf people are very serious. They're very stiff. They're very kind of, it's almost like European in that way. Like the thobe that I wear, when I moved to the Khalij, my local friend said, you can't wear the clothes that you wear, blue and pink and madri shinu, green thobes that you guys in Iran and Afghanistan and whatever wear. That's like a joke to us. You have to wear white, abyad, sukri, which means what would be sugar color, like a little gray, or lemuni, lemony. My friend who's Kuwaiti, actually, he said, I can't be seen with you. He took my hand, took me to a tailor, very gracious, kind Kuwaitis. He drove me down. He says, this color, and this color. When we go to Jummah, wear these thobes, wear these thobes to work. So they're very kind of serious, very, very kind of don't listen to music. They'll say, al-dhahka, like joking in public reduces your respect. So Salafi Islam is very much matching that temperament. So if early Islam, before you had this Sufism come in, before you had all this different cultural input, comes to us in that form, there's no way it can fit with the temperament of Persians, right? It's like Maulana says, you have to put the medicine in a sugary drink so that the people will drink it. That's why in my gatherings there's music and dance and whatnot, because these Greeks, they like music and dance, the people around him. So I think Islam was the same way, that the Sufi poets, they knew you had to inject some love and some of these vibes. Otherwise, Persians would not find Islam as fascinating. And the proof of that, I think, is that the Muslims you'll meet in California when you're back visiting home, the most atheist, Islamophobic, these tropes, you know them about Iranians. Iranians, Go to their home, who's on their shelf? Hafiz, Sadi, Rumi. The guy curses the Prophet ﷺ day and night, curses Islam, curses the mullahs. He sees me in Los Angeles, comes up to me and says, "You're an extremist," just like that. But that same guy, when I told him I translate Rumi, "Oh, Mullah, no, you know, this poem, you know, look at this poem. How would you translate this one?" So it goes to show you that these guys are like the pillars, the otad, as the Arabs would say, the pegs holding the Persians down in Islam. Anyway.
And I hope to explore more of that in the de-Islamization of Persian poetry segment of this podcast, because it's very interesting that you say that. But one thing that I got from one thing that I took away from what you said is that regardless if it's court poetry, Sufi poetry, or Persian poetry of any kind, themes like love, nature, and mysticism transcend all of those categories, and that's just part of Persian ethos and how they, articulate themselves in artistic expression.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of just the exploration of themes, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this interview how when you were a young person and you were first discovering Persian poetry, you were particularly drawn to poetry around sort of societal issues and things that seem very relevant to your human existence. In terms of medieval poetry, those sorts of themes are sort of more existential themes about morality and humanity. How are those themes explored in a particular way that might resonate with more contemporary readers?
Sure. I think it's important to consider that the context that we're living in, right? They were living in a very unstable world. It was before modernity, before states, before widespread security systems and police forces and 911. They were living during the Mongol, most of them. I mean, Hafez is living in his own instability that resembles it, but the Sadi and Rumi era was, the Mongol invasion. So they were living through in extreme brutality. I mean, even stuff that really, I don't want to get myself in hot water, stuff that would make the Israelis look like they have rahma for the Palestinians, because you look at what the Mongols were doing, they were just doing wholesale slaughter. They were just going and killing everyone. Like the worst of modern warfare pales in comparison to going in a town and literally every single human. I mean, there was one very interesting anecdote by a Buddhist monk who was traveling from China to Genghis Khan in I think modern Afghanistan to try to convince him to kill less, right? And he gets to Balkh, which is Rumi's town, after Rumi has left. And he says that the only thing there was blood splatters and dogs, wild dogs. I mean, that is just incredible to think about that. Rumi is living in Colonial. What is one of the reasons he's so melancholic? Imagine that happening to your friends, your family, your childhood home, right? So you think about that scenario. And then also the fact that there weren't states, again, to call 911. The modern world, a lot of morality is compelled by these structures that we've built, which is why our nightmare scenario is when they stop working, right? In COVID, how come the line to the gun store near me in America was around the block? Because everyone knows that if there's no state in America, it'll take about 3 days before there's gunfights in the street. I mean, we have gunfights generally, let alone without a state, right? Why are people brawling over toilet paper? Not just because they don't know about the lotar, ofta, or shatafa, but also because they don't have faith in each other in the absence of a state. Well, in this world, people, you need to have faith in each other, right? Any person you come across could just ruin your life when you're traveling. They just steal your stuff. They don't even have to kill you, just leave you for dead, and you will die of exposure. That's another reason, by the way, why theft is so serious in Islamic law. People don't really explain these things well. But in any case, we were living in a time where kind of extolling people's moral virtues, extolling moral virtues of people was of utmost importance. And that's why Sadi talks so much about morality and how you interact with people and don't hurt a single ant and all these things. And why Persian poets even go to the extreme of saying that a good non-Muslim is infinitely better than a wicked Muslim, right? In the modern tribalistic world, the way we might think, no, a Muslim brother, astaghfirullah, even if he's a sinner, is better than a kafir. But back then, who would you rather encounter? Would you rather encounter a just Christian person who gives you water and tells you which way to go and tells you how to avoid bandits, or run into a Muslim who's a bandit? So these things are of utmost importance. And that's why when you read Hafiz, Sadi, and Rumi, you get this very humanist understanding of morality of just be a good person, just treat other people well. For God's sake, don't harm a single person. Because they were living in this kind of terrifying dystopia where the Mongols were running amok, where no one was protecting you, where you could wake up tomorrow and an army would just show up at the gates of the city, and you better just hope you live to see the next day or the third day or whatever. You could just, and your ruler, like what happened in Hafez's life, could be a lunatic who says, no, lock the gates, and you just live through a siege. They're catapulting bodies with the Black Plague into the town. I mean, could you imagine what life would be like for those people? So, and that when you understand that, you get why they talk the way they talk, or they have the beliefs they have.
Absolutely. And in terms of, well, in terms of the transmission of these sorts of ideas in sort of the post-Abbasid era, we had an increasing syncretic society and this mingling of cultures and languages in the Islamic world. In what ways did the Persian poets contribute to this sort of cultural synthesis and exchange these ideas within diverse regions of the Islamic world?
Yeah, this is a great question. So Persian poetry becomes a vehicle that allows ideas and beliefs and themes and motifs to travel, because you can have a poet in the Balkans reciting, and then it travels to Istanbul, and then it gets to Shiraz, and then it gets to Delhi, and then it gets to Dhaka, and then all of a sudden, after 2 or 3 months, something you as a poet have written in one city is being recited in another. Such that Saadi says, of course, there was no photos or images back then, so no one knows what he looks like unless he announces himself, is just traveling and he hears his poetry being sung in the market. He's like, wow, that's my poem. I wrote that about 6 months ago somewhere. So this Persian poetry and Persianate culture becomes kind of like a something that brings Muslims together. That the spread of Sufism as well spreads the Islamic, Islam and the Persian vibes of Islam, if we could use that phrase. It's not so, maybe not accurate enough, but kind of struggling to explain it here. So Persian is kind of, it's almost like a wave where things can ride back and forth, where even when someone, for example, again, from those various parts of the Muslim world would meet, if they're educated, they can rely on Persian to interact with each other. And this is where we even get this idea of a Persianite realm, not Persian, like me ethnically, or you, but in the sense that they're ite, right? So they have this kind of Persian language, Persian culture, such that in Delhi and in Tehran, they're wearing similar clothes, they're reading similar poems, they're both celebrating Nowruz and Yalda, which is actually, I think, what, in 2 days? Yeah, in 2 days, or tomorrow as of this recording. So you have this Persian realm, and of course now it's fallen victim to modernity and nationalism and statecraft and whatnot. But you had this exchange of information and ideas, right? The same way that the Arabs had, that someone in Spain could write something and someone in Comoros or Somalia or Yemen could recite it. The same was true in our realm. It's just we don't think about it because the Arabs, in their nationalization, in their statecraft, they kept this going forward. It became useful for them to maintain that they're all Arab. For us, it was the opposite. Not for us, but for the others. For Indians, it no longer became useful to be attached to Iranian identity. Same with Afghans and Iraqis and Turks. So for different contextual reasons, we de-emphasized, or really, I should say, erased. Many states just straight up erased this reality.
And with this question, I hope that it doesn't double back too much, but there's something that I really wanted to know concerning the Masnawi. And you said that for Farsi speakers, it acted as an interpreter of the Quran. So how has the Masnawi acted as an interpretive mediator for the Quran for Farsi speakers? I mean, I remember hearing that in my more Salafic days, and I just thought, how blasphemous. You know, we have so many interpretations, tafsirs of the Quran, Tabari, Ibn Kathir. Why would Farsi speakers turn to a poet in order to better understand?
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's interesting. Actually, someone who introduced me at an Afghan masjid explained this. An Afghan gentleman who was Persian speaking, understood Rumi, he even took offense at this statement. And I will go even further. A lot of poets said that the Masnavi is like the Quran in Persian, as if it's just a translation. And poets from, Qasama Anvar in like the 1400s said this, all the way until Allama Iqbal in the 20th century said that he has basically written a Quran in Pahlavi, in the Persian language. It's something like Masnaviya Ma'naviya Mawlavi has Quran be Zaban Pahlavi, or something to this effect. There's another poem attributed to Jami. He says, Nemiguyam ka an Ali Janab has Payambar wali darad kitab. I wouldn't say that man of high station, Maulana, is a prophet, but he did have a book. The Masnavi is almost at that level, right? It's not wahi, it's not revelation, it's ilham, it's inspiration. So Persians really did believe that the Masnavi is kind of like a way for someone who can't directly access the Quran in Arabic to understand the text or the meanings, the deeper ideas there, right? Why? Well, back then people didn't really translate the Quran. Translating the Quran is more a product of modernity. You do find Quran with kind of like interspliced, like they'll have a big Arabic text and very small underneath. They'll just give literal word for word translations for people who don't know every Arabic word. But the idea was that you should be reading it in Arabic. So most people just can't really access the text directly. We're kind of like in a Catholic Church pre-Protestant Reformation thing where, you're a Persian peasant. You can't even access literary Persian, let alone Arabic. So you don't know what's in there. So how does the average person access the Quran or the ideas in the Quran? It's through the Masnavi, right? This text that it's a very simple. Now, for us, it doesn't feel simple because how many years have passed, but then it was in the contemporary Persian. And it's very easy to understand. Some of the parables very clearly are aimed at just average common folk. In fact, Maulana, he has this beautiful anecdote in his biography where someone from the royal court complained. He said, Maulana, there's no doubt that he's high up there. But why is it that everywhere he finds some sort of street sweeper or farmer, he becomes his friend? This is not becoming of him. And Maulana goes and tells him, well, didn't we have Nasaji and Hakkaki and Najjar and Zajjaj and Hallaj and all the Sufis at Tar? They were all from the middle class. They weren't high class. They were just people who worked with their hands. What's wrong with that? Right? So Rumi's clearly, when he's telling a story about a fly that lands on a piece of straw that's in a puddle of urine that a donkey has urinated, he's talking to a person who rides a donkey, some farmer, right? He's not talking to the king. Okay. And the Masnavi, it's interesting. I have 2 weekly classes for the Masnavi, one that's public and one that's with just a student. So every week I'm reading, 2-3 hours of the Masnavi, and we read with a commentary. And it's astonishing how often Rumi is either directly quoting, paraphrasing, or alluding to the Quran and the Hadith. So this is not just something, coming out of nowhere. Almost every story has some sort of reference or direct quote, or even extolling you to read the Quran. He says, if you don't understand this, go read this, and he'll give the verse. He'll quote a few words from it. So it is very much a text that is interacting with the Quran. So you can't read it in isolation from that.
Thank you for going into what it meant for the Masnawi to act as a mediator for Farsi speakers, because I never really understood, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other people who have heard that phrase, the Masnawi is the Persian Quran, never really understood what it meant in context. And I think a lot of people don't really consider that the prevalence of Quranic translations is something that's really a more modern phenomenon, and that I'm pretty sure people understood the Quran, the gist of it. Not everybody had access to it as reading material. So the way that you explained that really just bridged the gap for myself in understanding what that phrase meant. But to go on to a very interesting aspect of your work, something that you've pointed out, the de-Islamization of Persian poetry. I know people can go to your website and find plenty of writings and podcasts where you talk about Coleman Barks. But there's something that I found very interesting from an article that was on your website, and I'll just quote it verbatim. The act of separating Islam from not only Rumi's poetry started long before Coleman Barks came into the picture. In fact, people in the Victorian era began to disconnect Islam from the writings of various Muslim poets. Can you elaborate on the historical context of how English translations of Persian poetry became intertwined with the British colonial project? Because that's what you had mentioned in one of your podcasts, that the origins of these Persian translations began.
Sure, yeah. Westerners first became interested in Persian poetry, or aware of it, I think as early as the 1700s, but then it was mostly in Latin, and later you see German as well. And anyone who knows Middle East studies is aware that a lot of early material is in German. But the English translation, the wave really begins with the British colonization of India, because India then they took it over from what was the declining Mughal Empire, and the Mughals, their language of high culture and administration was mostly Persian. So the British, maybe not necessarily a particular interest, but just a reality on the ground, start working with Persian because they're taking over the state. And even then you see this wave of Iranians, but mostly Indians, going to London to tutor people who wanted to become British administrators in India because it was lucrative, and they wanted to get a foot up by already knowing, the language of administration. And the British, they have this thing where, I guess you guys are both in the UK, although you're not, 100% like the stereotypical image of of a person who's British or living in the UK. There is this sense that maybe you guys can speak to of, and generally Anglos, of interest in learning and documenting things. Anglos are just obsessed with documentation. So if you want to meet with a Muslim, they'll just say, yeah, we'll meet that day after us. Whereas an Anglo person will say, here's, the Google Meet link, and hit yes, and then we'll take a minutes, and then we'll have a recording, and we'll archive the recording in the minutes, and all these things. And maybe it's just a discussion about whether we should have a hot water boiler in the meeting room at work or something. And I'm like, does this even really need all? Anyway, so the British, and we have some learning to do with that respect, because, for example, when we went to Egypt, we Muslims didn't bother documenting and categorizing hieroglyphics, right? It would be the French went and discovered the Rosetta Stone. We didn't even really care about that stuff. So the British have this good tendency of interest in documenting and learning. So wherever they would go, they would send teams of anthropologists and linguists and translators to get a hold of what was going on the ground, to document and record the languages that are local. I have a good friend, Wal Al-Mahdi, out of nearby Bahrain, who has this amazing project called Words from the East, where he tries to point out the connections that Muslims often don't notice that Islam has created linguistically. That, for example, other than simple words like okay or uh-huh, what would you say is the most commonly understood word in the world? Maybe it's a word like kitab or Allah, or a lot of them are Muslim words, actually Islamicate words. So he kind of focuses on this. And because of that, he dives deep into the most unknown languages that maybe only 10 million people speak somewhere in some corner of the world. But invariably, some British colonial, administrator has written a dictionary or a commentary on what the language is and how the grammar is, right? Whereas even the locals, it might not have occurred to them to do that. So in any case, the British start to translate Persian texts to teach people Persian to help administer colonial India. And this is especially in the early days. Now, later in the 1830s, I think they end up just switching to Urdu. They switched to Hindustani. They dropped Persian. But for about the first 200 years of British presence, Persian is the language that they use. So especially texts that were common in the educated Indian Persianate context, like the Golestan, we find like over a dozen translations into English just from this era in British India. Right? So this is kind of where the first wave of translations come. And even once Persian is dropped as an administrative language, it still exists in the educated class. So for example, the best translation of the Bustan, it's an absolute joy to read, is translated by a doctor who is stationed in colonial India, who just learned Persian and just read it and translated it just out of personal interest, because he's a cool person. So this is where you see this first wave of English translations. And then coming later, you have people like Nicholson in the early 20th century translating the Masnavi in full for the first time. And then people like his students write translations that eventually people like Coleman Barks get their hands on. So that's like a short summary of the last 400 years, you could say, of Persian being translated into English.
In terms of, so you talked about these early colonial translations that we have and we have access to. How have modern scholars or translators sort of addressed or attempted to rectify the colonial influences in earlier English translations of Persian poetry, or have they just added to it?
There's a bit of both. I mean, you can definitely find, maybe up until recently, because the social milieu, as you're all aware, in Western society and academia has changed so dramatically in the last, 20, 30, 40 years, with, kind of becoming more anti-colonial. The departments are full of people from our heritage. So things are definitely changed now. And I think most Persian translations today are being done by people with Persian backgrounds, are people like Dick Davis, who have lived in Iran, who have a Persian wife, who are clearly very sympathetic to the Iranian experience. Like Dick Davis is not someone like a colonial administrator with like, what is that hat called? There's that one like round tan hat. He's not wearing one of the,
yeah.
Yeah, he's not wearing that hat walking around with the swagger stick in India. And, he's not that type of British guy. He's a very different type of British guy, with all respect to him. But those attitudes, you can see them, right? Even up until the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even, you can see this kind of, not necessarily mistranslation, not even necessarily taking things out. If, in fact, the era of colonialism, they were very faithful in their translation. They were very to the detail up until maybe it's annoying, even the literalness of their translation. But you sense this idea that they view themselves as superior to us. You could just kind of feel it, and especially where they're talking, right, in the introductions or things like that. So I think that the colonial influences have been addressed, especially, I mean, the fact that a project like mine is, supported and retweeted and liked and given a thumbs up by people who are proper academics. So I'm not a real academic, as you know. And also, basically, every text has been retranslated, so it's hard to find a text that you couldn't say, okay, there's a more, more contemporary, better translation. I mean, with examples that are so rare that people wouldn't care to read them. So yeah, I think the issue has been mostly addressed, but there is this kind of undercurrent of secularism and pro-modernism and anti-traditionalism in academia, which still that does kind of affect how people view religious works. I mean, it bears mentioning that academia is like an avowedly secular institution. Not saying that should be changed, but that you should just be aware of that fact. And also the market is a real thing. So I'm, inshallah, I think I can speak about it this much. There is a forthcoming book of Rumi translations that I have, but the economics of it is just, you have to think, okay, is this something that Westerners are interested to read? Because these are the people that are addressed in English. These are the people purchasing your book. And sure, you can, have a fully Muslim, nothing conceded book, but then you're going to publish with a minor Muslim publisher and 1,000 Muslims will read it. If you want a book that actually has a dawah effect that people will just read, I don't know, on the subway in New York or the tube in London, you're going to have to negotiate the Muslimness, right? Like, should I say prostration or bowing? Or should I say qibla or mihrab, or say pulpit and, pews? Like, at some level, you're going to have to concede to the host culture and language. And the host culture is a secular one. So at some level, it's never going to be perfect, unless you have pure passion projects, like books that have no economic viability whatsoever. Like, for example, the Quatrains of Rumi by Ibrahim Gamard. He's a Mevlevi Sheikh. He's actually a white American convert. That's the type of book where it's fully Muslim. All the Quran quotes are there. He doesn't change anything. It's fully literal, but it's a lifelong passion project. It's never going to sell a million copies like maybe Coleman Barks has sold. So anyway.
And on the topic of Coleman Barks, and that just goes back to when I was talking about the Conference of the Birds, that was my introduction to Persian poetry proper. The first book of quote unquote Persian poetry that I bought was a Rumi translation by Coleman Barks from Barnes and Nobles. I bought it out of interest, let me see what this Rumi guy is all about. I've already known about his Masnawi being the Persian Quran. And so let me see if all of the things I thought about him are confirmed in reading this translation by Coleman Barks. And because there was a certain amount of de-Islamization happening in his translation or rendition of Rumi poetry, it did kind of confirm what I thought. Like, I didn't find anything Islamic, or I didn't, any example of him being a Muslim. At one point, I even questioned, was Rumi a Muslim? But after doing further research, I come to find out that he was. What are the key factors contributing to the de-Islamization of Persian poetry in the modern era, which would give someone like Coleman Barks the liberty to do what he does in his work? Not trying to throw him under the table, but I'm just interested in what you believe might be the motivations for someone like himself and others who do this type of stuff.
Yeah, but ultimately, there's two main problems with this. One is that there's just a general translation issue where when you're translating something, at some level, things will be lost, right? So I'm just making this up. Maybe in Italy, there's a proverb about different types of cheese, and in the languages spoken by the First Nations in Northern Canada, there's a proverb about the different types of cold wind hitting your face. In Iran, we maybe joke about the different tea consistencies. It's fine. I think at some point it's fine to kind of change some things, right? This is just a reality with translation. You can't convey anything perfectly. There's always going to be this factor present. So that's one element. So that kind of covers changing prostration to bowing, or changing, for example, a mimbar to pulpit, right? Yes, pulpit does invoke the image of a church, right? But because there's no fully equivalent, right? This is important also for even second language people who do speak two languages, even whether bilingual or monolingual. We often miss, like for example, we might say that khane and home are the same, but they're not. Because when you say home, you think of a house in the UK or America. When you say khane, you think of four walls and a garden and a little, in a little basin of water and, like a place to pray in the corner, even though ostensibly they're the same word. So at some level, you're going to have to deal with the fact that you're dealing with either a Christian or like a post-Christian or secular Christian society. So you're going to have to deal with some of that element. And the other element is that you live in an Islamophobic environment, right? And then also an environment where Islam isn't understood. So for example, and this is a distinction, right? Like a Hindu nationalist in India might be an Islamophobe, but he still gets Islam at some level that no Westerner raised in a small town in Ohio gets Islam, right? Like Hindus I know from India, not to say they're Islamophobic, but the average Hindu friend I have in America, they know what Islam's all about. They know what Muslims believe. They know what the azan is. They can say a few Muslim phrases. They get Muslim culture. They know us. They've lived with us for how many centuries now? Like 8, 9 centuries almost. So they've been around us, right? So you're dealing with people who have Islamophobia, who don't understand Islam and the language barrier. It's very easy to see why someone like Coleman Barks would say, okay, we don't have to do all this Islamic stuff. We can tone it down and remove it and only keep the parts that are, speaks to Christians, like talking about Jesus. Like, for example, Rumi and Hafiz talk about Jesus and the breath of Jesus and the healing hand of Jesus and calling Shams, a Jesus-like figure very much. You can keep that stuff. But when you talk about, Imam Ali's sword and, fighting the kuffar and how, the Quran condemned the Jews for doing this, you can very quickly see why this would just kill the viability of a translation. Like if you translate all the stuff that's there without any discernment, then it can have a very negative effect. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. The degree is the issue. So for example, if someone walks into a mosque and they want to get dawah, the best thing to do is to address their issue and just give them generalities. Like if a married white woman walks into a mosque to get dawah, would the first thing you tell her be, you have to cover your hair and you have to divorce your husband or he has to convert? No, that's not how you start with such a person, right? But ideally, if they convert to Islam, then their husband would want to convert and then they would want to dress like Muslims dress. And then you would get to that conclusion. So maybe Coleman Barks is like that first kind of 15-minute doorway at the mosque chat. One God, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quran's the word of God. We don't eat pork, we fast, that's Coleman Barks. But understanding Islam fully is like reading a good translation or even the original or working with someone who can read the original. So I don't know. That's what I would say is the main factors to wrap it up. It's just it's like a perfect storm, basically, of reasons why you wouldn't want to convey or you couldn't convey the original ideas of Rumi to just, with no filter to just the mass audience in America or the UK as well.
And in terms of conveying that picture of Rumi, the most accurate picture possible while crossing those cultural boundaries and trying to mediate between the two, how do you see the role of sort of modern Iranian and diaspora scholars like yourself in the process of sort of re-Islamizing Persian poetry or de-Islamizing it, and what role do you see them playing in the future?
It's interesting. We're playing both roles. We're like enemies in this civil war, because there's some Iranians who hate the idea of Rumi being a Muslim, right? We know what's going on in Iran, that the push and pull in Iranian society with Islam and all that stuff. I mean, I don't need to dwell on it. People can very easily pull up material about this, or just ask an Iranian. They can very kind of give you a 5-minute explanation of what's going on. Basically, many Iranians are happy that Rumi is a figure that's already established in the West and secularized. They like that. They want an Iranian who's respected in the West, but they don't want him to be Muslim. So I would say the only pushback I've gotten from my project, other than very dedicated Coleman Barks fans, are mostly Iranians who say, what are you doing? Like, just let him be. Let Rumi be as he is. Why do you have to make him a mullah for us? Why do you have to drag Islam? Just let the whites like something about us. Just leave it, even if they're Muslim, but even if they're religious, they're like, just leave it, just let it be. It's all right. Just let them have it. So, but I would say the re-Islamizing, or just we can say even recontextualizing Rumi, I think it's our job, right? People who understand the culture he's coming from and can talk the, speak the dialect of the West, but can also appreciate Rumi in the original context, it's up to us to explain these things, right? So for example, to give you guys a small example before I give the real Rumi example, if I today say, tell my friend, hey, why are you coming to the mosque looking like a bum, looking like a homeless dude? Maybe 200 years from now, the housing crisis is fully solved in America, like Europe is, some European countries are getting there. And just talking like that is considered very kind of vile and lowly, because homelessness is solved, and we're embarrassed that it was such a big problem in America. It's all over our cities, as you well know, Terron. So maybe then they would say, oh, why would Muhammad say that? That's so wrong. He just like made light of this problem. And the same is true for Rumi. Like when he's telling a story about a man and a woman arguing, like a couple's fight. And by the way, the woman ends up being the correct one. He's very sympathetic to women, but he has like a line where he says, like she started crying and her husband was convinced, and you're like, women use their tears to get their way or something. So if you just present this to like a modern woman with no context, with no explanation that, this was just the way people talk, even really like up to 10 years ago, the way people talk, they might be very put off by that. And occasionally I do get these quotes just out of context DM'd to me saying, explain this. If he's so enlightened, why would he say this? Like Rumi, for example, didn't live in a world of political correctness. Now, he's not a racist, right? He's explicitly, not just because of Islam, but just because he's an enlightened person. But he says, like, for example, the change that he underwent when he converted to Islam was like a Hindu turning into a Roman. And an Indian person's like upset at this. Like, come on, that's racist. We're like, well, that was his way of saying you went from black to white, from 180-degree change. There was no political correctness or sensitivity regarding race then. But if you just view it from the modern point of view, of course, that looks really bad. So I understand like there's a wisdom to not just like the Hadith collection, I would say as well. There's a wisdom to not just unlimited access, no context translations to sensitive materials from the past, even if we ultimately agree with their content, but people just don't understand it properly. So anyway.
All right. And, we're coming to the conclusion part of this interview podcast, and we really do thank you for taking the time out to talk to us. And this will be our last set of questions. And it's really pertaining to how not only us, I mean, with whatever we can do, but yourself or anybody interested in this, how, we can foster a deeper appreciation for this kind of literature, because it really is amazing in my opinion. So, how can we cultivate a deeper appreciation for Persian poetry amongst Muslims? As I mentioned in the introduction, Persianate society, aspects of it expanded from the Balkans in Europe all the way to the Bengal in the Indian subcontinent. Because this poetry makes up a significant part of their heritage, and as well as for converts, a heritage that we've adopted. So what strategies could be effective in this endeavor of cultivating a deeper appreciation for poetry amongst Muslims?
Sure. I think what we need to do in the West is simply replicate what we did whenever we cross new boundaries. So when Persianate texts enter South Asia, they're translated in mass such that if you speak Urdu, you can really get a decent, very good, oftentimes, translation of any major Persian text. And they were taught in the madrasa system. So I think we as Western Muslims, we need to collect our resources, collect our efforts to translate, of course, not just Persian, but all the texts that are, we consider fundamental to understanding Islam as a civilization, as a religion, as a way of life, translate them into, good, contemporary, relatable English, and then have a system where we teach them to the next generation. So why don't we have a Masnavi class in every mosque? As far as I know, there's only one mosque in North America that Afghans run in Toronto, which I give a talk in Rumi about, where they have a weekly or monthly or bi-weekly Masnavi class. Why doesn't every mosque in America have a class on the Masnavi? We have excellent English translations available. Anyone with a basic understanding of Islamic studies could do a decent job of explaining the text. It's not so difficult. Every major city in America has a religious Iranian Muslim who could come help, who I'm sure would be happy. Like the Gulistan of Saadi, for example, so many good English translations exist. Why don't we have it in the Islamic school curricula? Why is the Islamic school in America just a Western school without sex education and maybe prayer at noontime and halal lunch? Why don't we just revamp? Why don't we just make a new curriculum? Why don't we have this self-confidence and the don't care attitude that Orthodox Jews have. Orthodox Jews don't care that their education doesn't comport with the West. They don't care. They're teaching Yiddish and Hebrew, and they're reading, their books, and they're doing their thing. And they're not obsessed with all of their kids being PhDs in this science and engineers. Why don't we be like Amish people? If we view, I mean, what do we want Islam to be in the West? Do we want Islam to be like being a secular Jew, where I have this identity, but I'm just a normal person like everyone else, and only when my identity comes under fire, or only during holidays I actually care about my identity? Or do we want to be like Orthodox Jews or Amish people, or other people who are committed to their faith tradition, where people know those people follow this religion, they take it seriously, XYZ, those types of things? Which one do we want to be? And I don't mean, when I say this, people think, oh, do we need to have an enclave and like reject outsiders and speak another language? No, we don't have to speak Pennsylvania Dutch or Yiddish. We can speak English, but we should have some. And I feel like, actually, I commend Muslims in the UK that they're much closer to that. With all the issues that people talk about, quote unquote, ghettoization, you do have a more robust system of education, not necessarily schools, but you have madrasas, you have Sunday schools, you have a huge mosque presence, you have neighborhoods, you assert yourselves in the public sphere in the way that American Muslims sadly just I don't know, maybe the vibe of immigration to America has produced this, but it's not the same. Terron, you could speak about it more as well.
Oh, definitely. I try to tell British Muslims all the time, like, I believe y'all take, well, not all of them, but a considerable amount take for granted what they have here in the UK compared to, I can't speak for all places in America, but in my part in particular, it was hard to be a Muslim, even though we had Zaytuna, Talif, and a really nice mosque in Santa Clara that was huge and had programs. All of these things were far away from each other, and the Muslim community wasn't as ghettoized. They were very sparse, dispersed away from each other. And so, it does create a different I don't want to say understanding of Islam, but going about practicing Islam, it definitely creates certain barriers that I don't see in the UK because of the way that Muslims have gone about their religion. But considering the universal themes of Persian poetry, what approaches would you suggest to introduce and make it appealing to a non-Muslim audience who might greatly benefit from its wisdom, without de-Islamizing it or having to remove, but are there things in it on its own merit that you believe non-Muslims could gravitate towards?
Absolutely. I think that Persian poetry ultimately addresses issues that are plaguing the Western mind. How do we live life? What is the purpose of being here? What is a moral code, an ethical code that I can live by? These issues, liberalism and secularism has produced some positive results in terms of physical conditions, but it has failed to answer these deeper questions. What's life all about? That's why you have this paradoxical situation where the most physically, materially well-off countries in the world also have some of the most depressed populations. Where when you go to, especially places like I've noticed in Scandinavia, where you just don't see any mood and vibes in the people. You don't see any hall, any state in them. So vibes is my version of a modern translation of state, because state it sounds like a country. When you say the hall, hall, ahwal is the same person. It's very muted. And even in the UK, for example, secular white Britons, maybe they don't feel like their lives are so meaningful, because what's filling up their lives? Nationalism and liberalism and secularism. It serves certain functions, but not the things that we need to live. Like the Bible says, man lives not on bread alone, right? So what's other than bread that we need to live on? And I would say ultimately what it takes is us, people like, actually us three specifically, are in a position where either we're reverted, converted, or we have like a significant non-Muslim presence or background where we understand what non-Muslims think like. And even me, for example, even though I became religious on my own, I was still raised in a Muslim culture. So it takes me to go to my convert friends or, loved ones, etc., and say, growing up as a white person in a white household, would this resonate with you? And sometimes it's shocking to say, no, this sounds goofy and weird. I wouldn't understand this at all 2 years ago, or even now, really. Like I realized that when I gave the Golistan to a white convert, thinking, here, this will help guide you. And they said, frankly, I read it, but I didn't really like it. It's just it wasn't fun to read. It's hard to connect to. And I don't blame them. Like, if you're not from a Persianate society, it'll be very difficult with just no prompting to just dig into this book and try to make sense of it. So we need to do more to, and I wouldn't say it's too dawah focused. Our interaction with non-Muslims or even Western Muslims who are not religious is just convert, take the Shahada. Here's this pamphlet, sister, convert to Islam. We should just focus on conveying Islam and making it well understood, and then just let the guiding happen, let the cards fall where they may. We don't convey enough. We're just too focused on like tallying. Oh, I have 1,000 shahadas from Speaker's Corner. Okay, and what? How many of them are Muslim today? Probably, I reckon of those street shahadas, 10% are Muslim 5 years from now. So anyway.
Yeah, you're right. I really don't, with the methods of dawah that I see today, I really don't see any type of trying to cultivate a love of Islam in the people they're talking to, not just to convert them, but just lowering the threshold. Let people see that, hey, my Muslim neighbor isn't somebody that I have to fear. They're trustworthy people. They have a rich culture, a heritage, and I believe that might be a way for people, if they're interested in converting, to come to Islam by seeing just how Muslims act. Okay, they have a rich heritage. Aspects of this heritage have gems of wisdom that I could live my life by, and maybe eventually even turn my heart towards Islam because it's full of other things that I couldn't have imagined. But you're right, it does seem more focused on trying to get numbers or trying to get people to understand this is what Islam is about, this is what Islam is about, when most of the time it's just your particular interpretation, when there's a whole world of interpretations out there that may differ from this. You hit the nail on the head, and I believe this kind of topic that which you just brought up, could be expounded upon, for hours. But
in terms of bridging these cultural religious gaps that we're talking about, and now that we're all living in this like increasingly globalized society where Muslims are spread out all across the world and Persian communities are spread out all across the world, how does the study of Persian poetry in particular help us to better understand how Iran views itself and its place in the world today? You already sort of touched on that a little bit, but in terms of just helping to understand the complexity of what Iran is going through, how does Persian poetry help people outside Iran to do that?
Absolutely. I actually wrote a piece for New Lines magazine about this. I think I was living in Iran at the time, about 2 years ago. But Persian poetry is a great lens to, first of all, just understand the psyche and mindset of Iranians, because it's just a way, Iranians express themselves through Persian poetry, but the mindset that you find expressed there oftentimes, the ideas that are taken for granted, they really are the way that Iranians view the world. And oftentimes we actually express ourselves through the lens of poetry, right? You look at political debates in Iran, they unfold with politicians tweeting and retweeting each other, fighting with poetry couplets, fighting with Hafez and Maulana, right? So understanding poetry will help you understand Iran, especially those who are of Persian heritage like us who grew up abroad. It's a really good way to understand your culture better, to understand the way Iranians view the world, to go to Iran and read the things on the walls, or read the writing on your carpet. And whenever you want to interact with society and understand it better, you need to understand what's dear to them. And if you want to know Iranian society, it's really good ways to know the poetry that Iranians love and that they feel represents themselves, right? Whenever you want to learn a religion, for example, don't just read what polemicists say about the religion. Ask the followers of the religion what they say about the religion. And I'd say don't read about Iran what Iran watchers, who are funded by anti-Iran elements say. See what Iranians tell you what Iran is all about. When they say, oh, a big part of Iranian culture are these 4 or 5 poets, well, maybe it's worth exploring them to see what those people have to say, and the type of culture you're dealing with. And that's why Obama, I think, was the last president to make an effort to actually reach out to Iranians. Before then, it was kind of the Khatami era. They had Clinton tried, and Obama gave like the last effort, and then now I think it's just a lost cause. Like, I don't think the current government and the American government will ever come to terms, unfortunately. Something probably we'll never see. But Obama, in his aid message, when he was trying to get the Iran deal, he would quote Hafez and quote Bani Adam by Sadi, this famous poem, about humanity. So it showed that, him, all things you want to say about him, he understood this about the Iranian people. He had Iranian advisors who explained to him and told him that he made an effort to get to Iranians on their own level, if that makes sense.
So just to round off, I just want to go back to where we started with your hashtag and the viral Twitter thread that sort of kicked off your project, initially garnered a lot of support and attention to your project. How do you think social media in particular can be harnessed to sort of challenge misunderstandings about Islamic culture and intellectual heritage? And how do you use social media personally to do that?
Definitely. Social media is an amazing, indispensable tool. I hate it when people say, to sound, intellectual, like, oh, I don't like social media. I don't really go on there. Social media is like having a soapbox at Speaker's Corner, except anyone in the world can access what you're saying. I mean, it's incredible. You average accounts go viral often on Twitter. It's very common to see a viral tweet and you click and the account has 250 followers and it's been there for 10 years. So isn't that incredible? All the thoughts that pass through your mind, if you just hone them a bit and post them out there, that all of a sudden 10 million people could view that in 2 days. If your thoughts are if you think it's worth hearing, why not just put it there? And especially us as Muslims, we don't have billionaires funding media operations for us. We don't have access to institutions and things like that. And in our countries, so many things are barriers to expressing ourselves. But if you're a Western Muslim and you speak English and you're in a country with freedom of speech like the UK, like Canada, America, with some degree of freedom to speak, I think we're doing a disservice to not be very active on Twitter, to not be fighting back in the information warfare, right? I don't think we should wage informational war offensively, but if it's being fought against us, we should at least defend ourselves. And even if you look at the difference between the earlier wars in Palestine and the Iraq War, and now, it's all because of Twitter. Not even just social media, Twitter specifically is responsible for completely upending the narrative. The Gazans on Twitter, and that's why they tried to cut off the internet. That's why when stuff happens, Middle Eastern governments, whether Israeli or otherwise, try to get rid of the internet because they know that's what shapes the narrative. And the boomers, may God protect them all, we all have elderly relatives, they're on the way out. And same with their kids too. There will come a day, they're the ones that support Israel the most, for example. Why is it precipitously decline every generation? Once they're gone, once we're at the helm, our generation is all consuming information from social media. So I think, not every Muslim, it's not like a fard, it's a fard kifaya, you could say. We all have, it's not fard ain, that's not for every single person, but generally the Muslims should have a group of people, like maybe not the tactics they use, but the Brits are really good at this. The British Muslims, I don't agree with all the stuff they do, but they understand this better, that they need to be out there and making content and making YouTube videos and arguing with Piers Morgan. Whether I agree with their aqidah or their methodologies or personalities is a different story. But Western Muslims are like, American Muslims in the West are ages behind this understanding, unfortunately.
And again, you've said a lot, and we thank you for coming on our platform to talk about this. And the last part that I would like, can you just let people know where can they find you? What can they do in order to gain a better appreciation of Persian poetry? And just plug in your website or
yeah, sure.
Find you on social media.
So the website is www.persianpoetics.com, persianpoetics.com. And on that same you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And my personal is just Sharghzadeh on also mostly Instagram and Twitter. But the majority of my posts, Persian Poetics, it's just universal. Everything is posted everywhere. But most of what I talk about is on my personal Twitter account. So that's where they can find me. And if you're interested in learning Persian poetry, Persian Poetics, it's a monthly sign up for this large learning platform. There's probably hundreds of hours of content, if not like 1,000 hours of recorded classes and also live classes. And I think the lowest tier is $14.99 a month. So you can sign up and you get access to, and all the classes almost are bilingual. So they're in Persian and in English. You can watch either or watch both to help your Persian. And I also tutor as well for those who are interested. But yeah, those are the ways that you can kind of access my work. Persian Poetics has it everything. The website has my socials. It has, the things I've appeared on and also just the classes as well. And also I have a book that's forthcoming. So keep your eyes out on my social media and hopefully at some point in the near future, I can post pre-order information.
Definitely, and maybe we can bring you back on in order to discuss.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Because again, from I feel like I did a lot of research, but considering how expansive this topic is, I know I didn't do enough. And it's something that I really hope to, in the future, bring you on, or even if I don't bring you on, but to discuss certain more aspects of Persian poetry and Persianite society in general, because I feel like in our modern context, it seems like we have I don't want to say an Arabized version of Islam, but considering where a lot of the money has come from in order to spread Islamic material in the West, you know, I feel like we're getting a certain perspective that hasn't always been for the whole of Muslims. So, and again, we thank you for coming on. Roxanna, is there anything that you'd like to say before we end this?
No, I just wanted to, yeah, thank you for giving us your time. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
From you.
It's my pleasure.
All right. And we don't have anything else.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys taking the time to do this research and talk to me and invite me onto your wonderful platform.
I want to thank you in particular because now I have an interview that my mom will be excited to watch. And
I'm so glad. That makes me so happy.
All right. On that note, assalamu alaikum, bro. And I hope that we speak to you again.
Inshallah, inshallah. Khuda hafiz. Like